Again, would like to welcome you all today and have Rich, can you do the roll call, please, when you get back to your, able to get back to your station?
Thank you. Good morning. Chairman, Representative Jim Kelly is present. Vice Chairman, Representative Hoheisel is present. Ranking Minority Member, Representative Hsu is present. Representative Anderson is present in person. Representative Baker.
I'm here.
Is remote. Representative Bergkamp is present in person. Representative Day.
I'm here.
Yep, I see a remote. Thank you. Representative Donahoe. Representative Finney.
Present.
Remote, thank you. Representative Kessler is present in person. Representative Lynn is present in person. Representative Neely. Very good. Representative Poskin. Thank you. Present. Representative Samsel. I'll get your nameplate. You can stay there. Representative Topliker is present. Representative Wassinger.
Present.
Representative Weigel is present in person. I'll keep track of the others that may be joining us just a little bit late.
Thank you, Rich. Next agenda item is request for bill introductions. Have any bill introductions? I have three bills that I've been asked to introduce, committee bills. Representative Waymaster asked me to introduce these. The first one is 21 RS 0046, and this is an act enacting the Kansas Rural Home Loan Guarantee Act. And then 21 RS 0150, an act concerning agriculture relating to financial institutions enacting the Kansas Agricultural Loan Guarantee Program. And the third one is 21 RS 0139, and this is an act concerning financial institutions relating to appraisals, sales, comparison approach, unique residential real estate in rural counties. So those three were asked. Do I need to get the RS numbers on those? Okay. Okay, today is kind of the official kickoff of the rural development portion of our committee. And we've got a few bills that have made our way that will fit this. We picked up some in just the last couple days on this, including we were assigned, this is not rural development, but we were assigned a payday lending bill out of Judiciary Committee and a trauma bill out of the Health Committee. So we'll see those. So that adds to our mix. But we're going to kick off today on the rural development. And I'm real pleased that we've been able to work out to have Chris Harris of the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation join us today. I have had the pleasure of working with Chris from about back in 2014 when he was with the Department of Commerce, and I was working on the rural opportunity zones and looking at trying to get 3 counties in my area into that. And Chris is very knowledgeable. He went from the Department of Commerce to the Kauffman Foundation, and earlier this session, I sent you the article that Chris had written, and he is in his introduction, he'll tell you a little bit about himself and his connection to rural Kansas, and kind of some of the things that he's worked on and will be working on. So it's a pleasure for me to introduce Chris Harris, Senior Program Officer of the Kauffman Foundation. And Chris, welcome to the Financial Institutions Rural Development Committee, and appreciate you being here today. And hopefully we can generate some questions that will lead us into some topics as we go forward with rural development. A lot of work to be done, and you're going to be a great one to kick it off.
Thank you, Representative Kelly. I really appreciate the introduction. And most of all, I just appreciate the opportunity to work with you again and to work with everyone on the committee. Can you hear me? Am I coming through loud and clear? All right, I hope so.
You're good, Chris.
Okay. Well, I feel I need to apologize in advance for any background dog barking or anything of that nature. We're doing the 2 working parents, 2 toddlers, and 2 dogs all at home in an old farmhouse, so it gets rather loud. But I really do appreciate the opportunity to come and join you. And I have to say, I really love the new name of the committee, adding rural development to the name. It's I'm excited to see the work that you're going to be doing, and I'm honored to be part of the kickoff of that. And as Representative Kelly mentioned, my hope is that we can talk a little bit about the work that we have done, what I think are positive trends facing rural America right now, and some areas, some ideas you could explore as you embark on this journey of rural development and building on the base that we've built over the last several years. You know, we all understand the importance of the work that you're doing. It's really critical to the future of our state, and I hope we all share the goal of enabling all parts, urban, suburban, and rural parts of our state to be successful. And we need each part of our state to be successful if we're going to get where we want to get to. And this is personal to me in a lot of ways. I am a lifelong Kansan. I grew up in rural Kansas for nearly most of my life, a few years in Lawrence to get my degree. I was born in Dodge City. In a lot of ways, I tend to think of the entire state as my hometown. I've lived in Scott City, Salina, Boyington, Hayes, Pomona. I have to write them down just to remember them all. I never made it down to Southeast Kansas. I'm sorry, Representative Kelly. I never made it down to Independence, but I do feel an affinity for the entire state. And you know, that's where we live now. I live in rural Douglas County, about halfway between Overbrook and Baldwin. And my wife, who also is a lifelong rural Kansan, she's from Franklin County, and her family still ranches there. We're here in rural Kansas raising our family. And, you know, so there is a personal component to this, and it's, you know, it's a passion of mine, but it's also the primary focus of my work. I'm a senior program officer in entrepreneurship at the Kauffman Foundation. We're based in Kansas City, Missouri, but we work across the country. And I specifically work on what we call the Heartland Strategy, where we seek ways to support entrepreneurship in the region. So when we say the Heartland region, we mean Missouri, Iowa, and Nebraska. And I lead rural initiatives and strategies as part of the Heartland team. And it's a newer strategy. I would love to get into some of the things we've already kicked off. I'll mention a few. And we have big plans. We believe, we understand that entrepreneurship is critical to the future of not only rural America, but all of America. And there's a lot of work to do. And you know, one thing I would point out, you know, one thing that's really critical to understand is that research has shown that, and I think most people instinctively understand this, that most net new job creation is driven by businesses under 5 years old. So we're talking new businesses. And that, in the context of rural communities, that's really concerning when you see what the startup rate in rural communities has done over 50 years. 50 years ago, in the 1970s, 20% of all startups in the country were located in a rural area or a small town. Today, it is 10%. And so, and it continues to decline. And that is really concerning. That is a major part of our economic engine that underpins a lot of our goals for population growth and community vitality. And it's something that we at the Kauffman Foundation specifically focus on. We fund organizations that are working directly with entrepreneurs that help them in their efforts to start and grow businesses. And we do that through grant making. And we'll get a little bit more into that here soon. But we also know, not only do we know that entrepreneurship is critical to the success of rural communities, we also know that we can't do it alone. Starting or growing a business, the ability to do that, an outcome of so many different systems and pressures and trends that are feeding into it. And we know that we can't be successful in supporting the growth of the heartland through entrepreneurship if you're not successful. We need community leaders to be successful in their efforts to build vibrant ecosystems that support entrepreneurs if we're going to have long-term success in growing our rural economies through entrepreneurship. As Representative Kelly mentioned, reached out to me after I wrote an article. I hope you've had a chance to read it. It gives a good sense of how we're approaching the work, our view on I should say my view on rural issues and the work ahead of us. And I want to revisit some of those the things I mentioned in that article, some of the things that give me optimism. But before we do that, I think it's important to understand and acknowledge the scope of the challenges that we face in rural communities. And I'm specifically, this is true of all rural areas, but I think it's especially true here in rural Kansas. Some of these trends we all are very familiar with. But I don't start with the negative to be negative. I see very important reasons to be optimistic about where we could go in rural Kansas. But it's important to look at where we're at. And especially because these challenges they're entrenched, they're complex, and there's not a single program that can be implemented that solves it. You need to think in systems. You need to think about how every single part of the system feeds into this and how every challenge has its own contribution to whether a community is viable or has a pathway to growth. And, we're familiar with a lot of these. We have infrastructure gaps, challenges in broadband. We talk about broadband a lot to the point where we think that all of rural Kansas is underserved, and that's not true. But it is there are gaps in the map, and it is a critically important thing that we address that. We need to have addressed it years ago. It's inexcusable going forward that we don't address it. Our healthcare system was already facing really intense pressure, and that was even before the pandemic. I know Representative Kelly in your region, that's been, with hospitals closing, that's not an unfamiliar story in any rural region of our country. I wish it was less familiar to us here in Kansas, but it is a reality, and the pandemic has not made that easier. We have a childcare crisis. It is difficult to find childcare in rural Kansas, and it's something I hope we can spend a lot more time thinking about, because it's an issue of viability. The ability of someone to choose to remain in a rural community or to move to a rural community. And with some of the trends coming out of COVID, this is especially important for us to tackle here soon. We also have growing news deserts in our communities, which only serves to help deepen the divides that we're all struggling with. And we're not really going to get into news deserts, but I think it is worth mentioning that it is a challenge in rural communities. And all of this is on the tail end of decades of outmigration, as we've seen the rural economy change over decades. And again, not an unfamiliar story to us here in our region, less so maybe in other rural communities. we've had a habit recently of saying that the pandemic has changed everything. And, you know, and it's true, some things have changed. But I think the most important change of all is that we can no longer ignore some of the challenges that have been entrenched for so long. They're clear to see, for everyone to see. And it's easier today more than ever to see how they're all interlinked with each other, how they feed into each other. And if we don't decide to do something about that now, the next crisis is going to be that much harder. And the reality is, crises don't really have an end; they just feed into the next, right? And one event informs the next. And this clarity, I think today we have an opportunity for clarity. That's what one of the few silver linings of COVID really is, that we can see these challenges, and maybe that's an opportunity to be part of a positive change for rural Kansas. And frankly, I'm optimistic, and I want to get into a little bit of why I am optimistic about where we can go from here. Really, there are two specific reasons for my optimism. And the first is that, you know, recent data shows that there is lasting and widespread appeal of rural life in all parts of our country. And you know, it's something we've talked about a lot over the years. One of the things we tell people about living in rural America is that we have a great quality of life, that we, you know, it kind of grates my gears a little bit when we talk about there being a cheaper cost of living. If you read the article, I kind of mentioned that because to me, that's not the value of rural Kansas or rural America. The value is everything else. It's all those things that make rural communities a great place to live. And I think if you look at the data, we'll get into that here in a second, it could be our greatest advantage, one of our greatest competitive advantages going forward. So I'm new to WebEx. I've been using Zoom for the entire pandemic, so I'm not quite sure how to share a screen. So I'm just going to, the slides are in the version that I shared with you earlier, or shared with Rich. But there are a couple of callouts that you'll see in the slides. I encourage you to look at the full study from Pew and from Gallup that I'm about to reference. But the first, so in 2018, prior to the pandemic, the Pew Research Center did a national survey. They did one several years prior as well. Oh, looks like they made me the presenter. They did one several years prior and found some similar trends, and it strengthened a little bit in 2018. They found that there was more interest from urban and suburban residents, current urban and suburban residents, in moving to a rural community than there was interest in rural residents moving to urban or suburban. So 30% of urban, 35% of suburban residents were interested in moving to a rural community. And only 20% of rural residents were interested in making the reverse move, moving to a bigger city. So it flies right in the face of what we understand, what we think we understand about how people view living in a small town. It doesn't necessarily align with the population trends that we've seen over the years, but it definitely reflects interest, right? And you know, the pandemic seems to have accelerated this trend. Gallup, literally just this last month in January, released a new national survey. This is all post-pandemic survey data, and it found that 48% of respondents in the national survey wanted to live in a small town or rural area. They also found that 75% of current rural residents want to stay there, whereas only 47% of people living in a big city said the same. And again, they're sentiments, not actual people renting a U-Haul and moving yet, but it does indicate that there is reason to be hopeful, that there is a wealth or wellspring of positive sentiment about the idea of rural life that we could tap into. And when we get into some of the recommendations that I'll make, I think these are some ways that we could do that. You know, one thing in looking at the Gallup survey, that I found really encouraging is that the interest in rural is fairly diverse. There's interest from across the political spectrum with both older and younger individuals and with people of color. And that really I found encouraging, frankly. And I think that is a good sign for the future. Now, the Pew survey back in 2018, I wish the Gallup survey did something similar, but Pew a few years ago, they went a little deeper on what people want from where they choose to live. And I think it's important information because it gives us some sense of direction for where we might focus in the future. We all understand there are certain non-negotiable factors that that we all think about when we consider moving to a town. Things like the healthcare access and quality of schools and jobs and things like that. Beyond that, Pew asked about some of those more intangible factors, those other things that we consider. When you talk to someone, the are there things to do in town kind of questions. And I find that pretty interesting. The responses are really similar, whether you're asking someone from an urban, suburban, or rural communities, we all kind of want the same thing. 60% want a good place, according to Pew. 60% want a good place to raise children. More than 40% want access to art, outdoor, and recreational activities. And a lot of folks, they want access to arts and culture and a sense of community. And, if you live in a rural community, have lived in a rural community, know people that live in a rural town, you know that we know how to do this. We know how to make good places to live. Like I said earlier, Kansas, it feels like my hometown. And, I can think of so many examples of things that make our small towns great places to live. I'm sure we all have our favorites. Top of mind for me are things like the trail system in Allen County, community theater, Carnival and Tribune. I lived in Hoisington. I loved Labor Day celebrations. Cortland Fun Day in Republic County. I just love their approach to everything that they do. And there are countless examples of how we make our communities fun, fulfilling places to live. We know how to do this. We need to do a lot more of it, and we need to pair it with strong support for entrepreneurs and remote workers. And that's where we're going to focus a lot in our in the rest of my presentation. The second reason, before we get into that, the second reason I find optimism for the future of rural Kansas and the broader region as a whole is that there is an example of a community that has made changes that has resulted in real growth. In that example, and what we could learn from it, I don't pretend to think that we could just emulate it and like copy it in every community, but we could learn a lot from it. And that ability to learn, ability to apply things that have worked in this community to others is my second reason for optimism. It's something that we're thinking a lot about right now at the foundation. If I described a rural town here in the heartland, and let's say it's around 2,000 people, historically had a focus on agriculture, and had been losing 10% of their population since the 1970s, you wouldn't be able to tell me what town I'm talking about. Because the reality is I could be talking about hundreds of towns. And that's a description that rings true for a lot of us. And it feels almost overwhelming how common that description is. But the reality is there is an example of a community that has bucked that trend, that has made different choices. And that community is Ord, Nebraska, so north central Nebraska. Basically go to Manhattan and drive north for a few hours and you'll get there. And Ord fits that description exactly. You look at their population trends in the 1970s, it was well over 10%. It continued until about the late 90s. And about 20 years ago, 1999, they decided to make different choices. They decided to change their focus and where they invest their financially and just overall community energy. They invested in a system that adapts to and benefits from change. The first thing they did is there was a case study, first of all, that we helped. We worked with Don Mackey from Nebraska to help put together, covering the work that they've done over the last 20 years. I encourage you to go out and read it. I believe I shared that document with the committee. There's a lot of great stuff in there. There's a lot there, but I'll give you a quick summary. But the first thing, and one of the most important things they did, is they didn't try to solve every crisis at once. That is so overwhelming that it just grinds everything to a halt. Instead, they asked themselves where they want to be in 20 years, and then they started finding things they could do immediately that starts moving along that timeline. And they started making investments that wouldn't pay off for quite some time. So the first thing they did after they asked that question is in 1999, they started a community foundation, and they developed a community-wide leadership training program. They also repurposed city and county funds, and they used those to provide capital, flexible capital and gap lending programs for entrepreneurs, new and existing entrepreneurs, I should add. And on top of that, all new and existing entrepreneurs in Ord, they started this back then, they're still doing it today. They're provided with mentoring from experienced business owners in the region. And they also focused on community improvement, bike trails and outdoor recreation and things like that. And you know, they did all of that. That's all difficult enough, right? That takes an impressive coalition, adaptive leadership, and dedicated folks to accomplish. But the most impressive thing they did was they stuck with it for 20 years. I mentioned in my article, I firmly believe that the biggest disinvestment we make in rural communities is time. We keep attacking it with 2 or 3 year solutions, but we're talking about generational change here, and it's going to take time to see it work. And Ord did that. And there's another slide I would share with you, but it's in the materials. Ord, what has it meant for them? Well, I should add, I was actually there right before the pandemic hit in November 2019, and the difference there was palpable. We were driving around town, and I'm used to when we drive past a empty building in a rural town, we talk about what was there before, and it wasn't that here. There wasn't that like typical feeling of loss. It was about all the conversation was about the excitement about who might reinvent that space, and it was really exciting to see. And so if you have a chance to visit, I encourage you to do that. And it's had tangible impact on their community. Ord has stopped their population loss. If you look at their most recent population figures, they've stabilized. They're not growing leaps and bounds, but they're not losing 15% of their population decade over decade. And we all know that is just massive change. And if you're in the town, if you're talking with folks there, they're really quick to point out that their fastest growing population segment is young families under the age of 40. And that is huge. That is huge. And obviously, I have to point out that there are so many factors that contribute to population trends and how a community grows over time. But it's also true that they have done something that has worked. This is what they've done. It has resulted in this. And there's a lot to learn from that. And it informs some of what we'll talk about here soon. And one thing I hope you take away from this, from the presentation and any work that you do in rural communities is language matters. Something I wrote about in the Kaufman Currents article that I hope you all read. And something that I think is important to keep front of mind as we move forward is that how we talk about our problems, about rural problems in particular, it's problematic. It shapes a lot of our solutions and how we approach it. The narrative in most cases is one of loss and decay. We talk about what left town, the way things used to be, and what others really have that we don't. And here's my biggest pet peeve. We use terms like brain drain. We think we're talking about people that left, but we're also talking about how we're dismissing the capacity of people that stayed. And that's particularly challenging. And, like I said, we talk about problems, and that shapes how we respond. It shapes, we start thinking about them as inevitable and unsolvable, and we start to accept the outcomes as a given. And, in a lot of rural communities, a lot of conversations about rural communities in rural Kansas, all of our thoughts, they bend toward thinking, how can we keep our kids and our employers here? And I just want people to understand that the reality is that goal is too narrow. We cannot be successful in Kansas if our goal is to build barriers to keep people from leaving. But we can be successful if we focus on building environments that people want to be a part of. That's what Ord did. That's what some of our most exciting small towns are doing. And I hope we can encourage all parts of rural Kansas to do it in the future. You know, because entrepreneurs, they are the response to that narrative of loss. They're the ones that come in and build something new, even in the face of skepticism. And that's the work that we do at the foundation, supporting folks like that. You know, and like I said earlier, entrepreneurs drive economic growth, and we're not going to see more of that growth if we only rely on traditional economic development practices of recruitment or retention of businesses. It's important, obviously, but it can't be the entire picture. We have to think about how we support the first part of the funnel, getting those growth in new businesses. And so, you know, Kauffman Foundation, like I said, we fund organizations that work directly with entrepreneurs. Big part of that is policy. You know, we need your help in building an environment that is conducive, supportive of people that want to start and grow businesses. And there are a lot of ways that policymakers on the federal, state, and local levels can impact the ability of someone to start and grow a business, and especially when it's done in partnership with local leaders. In 2019, October 2019, the Kauffman Foundation published America's New Business Plan, which is a series of recommendations for federal, state, and local policymakers of policy ideas that you could explore or potentially implement that would be helpful to entrepreneurs. I encourage you to read that. And I should note there's a refresh coming later this month. I'll make sure that the committee gets a copy of that. When I look through that, starting with American New Business Plan as a base, there are several policy areas that I think are really critical or relevant to rural communities. But before we dive into that, I do want to say that it is important to note that we're not starting from square one. There are some programs and tools that have had impact in rural communities. And, you know, one of our greatest assets is really, you know, local leaders, and they have some tools in their toolbox, and they're working hard to build entrepreneurial ecosystems in small towns across Kansas. And I do encourage you to get feedback from those folks and understand where the gaps are. They have a very valuable perspective. And I'd love to connect you with some folks that are doing some really interesting work across the state if your committee finds that helpful. But I have summarized basically 5 recommendations, starting from America's New Business Plan and drawn from my experience in rural communities and understanding the challenges that they face, that I think are important to explore. The first is, I think, and I think this is common sense here, you need to review all current rural tools and programs. You know, in America's New Business Plan, we highlight that the impact of simplifying business registration and removing licensing costs, and you know, that's territory that's, you know, I know the legislature has explored before. It's obviously valuable to continue to do that, and explore how we can make it easier, lower the barrier to entry for small businesses. And so, by all means, I do encourage that, but I also encourage you to go a step further and review all programs that have impact on rural communities and evaluate how the program can be updated to support rural leaders who are trying to build their entrepreneurial ecosystems and support potential new rural residents working remotely. You know, just off the top of my head, we have programs like the Community Service Tax Credit, which supports, in most cases, rural hospitals, but nonprofits generally. Rural Opportunity Zones, as Representative Kelly mentioned. I understand it's up for extension. CDBG touches a lot of rural communities. The Historic Preservation Tax Credit could be a valuable tool in downtown improvement. And these are just examples of programs that have really had impact in rural communities over the decades, and especially when you have, you know, skilled rural leaders that are using them. And I would recommend gathering specific input from those leaders and exploring ways you could enhance these programs with rural entrepreneurship in mind. I think there's a lot of runway there. So moving beyond like the obvious, one thing we talk about in America's New Business Plan, we call them catalyst grants. I believe this is something that could be very helpful in rural communities. So it's, if you look at a lot of the challenges we have in rural towns, the healthcare crisis, childcare crisis, what have you, food access. If you flip them on their ear, they're also entrepreneurial challenges. These are challenges demanding an entrepreneurial solution, and we should invest in entrepreneurs that are willing to step up and tackle these. And that's where we're going to see some of our more innovative solutions to some of these really long-standing entrenched challenges. Rural communities across the country are doing, entrepreneurs are doing this all over the country. One example I give is an entrepreneur in rural Montana, where they also have a massive childcare crisis. She started a company that handles back office operations and certification for rural in-home daycares. She tested it with some grant funding in Montana, and it worked so well that she raised $6 million in venture capital, scaled it across the state, and expanded to Colorado. And that's it's great to see something like that. And I was talking with folks in Pennsylvania just a few weeks ago, where rural entrepreneurs are starting to repurpose hospitals and schools that have closed and started turning them into places to provide telemedicine and housing. And one of the things I really liked about their concept is reusing the commercial kitchens to use them as kitchen incubators for food entrepreneurs that are just starting out. And one possible way to support solutions like this is to provide early stage proof of concept funding. This is the kind of funding that is most difficult for most entrepreneurs to get. And we provide more detail in America's New Business Plan, but and I encourage you to read that. But we have to appreciate that all entrepreneurs struggle to access early capital, and because you're farthest from the liquidity event, you haven't proved your concept out. This is hard money for people to get, and not everyone can rely on friends and family. Most people can't. And the reality is we need people in that stage of business formation to be successful, especially in rural communities. I would suggest exploring ways you could provide grants to entrepreneurs seeking to address rural challenges, maybe senior mobility or food delivery or potentially even scalable solutions in ag tech. And if this program could be paired with other support mechanisms, it could be really powerful. So we have existing capital options through the e-community program with obviously the SBA, Commerce, other places like that could provide some scale assistance. We're also talking about entrepreneurs that likely would benefit from an SBIR grant, which I should add is an area our state has woefully underperformed in. And it's I know it's not much comfort, but our neighbor states haven't done much better either. So many entrepreneurs in the state of Kansas are not getting that early stage funding, and it could be accomplished through the through something like a Catalyst grant. So I encourage you to explore that. My third recommendation is to look at your existing rural initiatives that are popping up across the state or that the state has put in place and find ways to enhance them. So as I mentioned earlier, COVID has highlighted a unique opportunity for rural communities. Individuals are starting to consider, they have been for some time, but now with the widespread acceptance of remote work culturally with employers, it's more viable. They're exploring the idea of moving to a rural community, and it's important that we try to capture our share of that interest. And so, I would say it's important to find ways to support rural and remote. It's as simple as that. There's already an initiative that has sprung up in north central Kansas. And some of you are probably already familiar with it, with Nick Poles' work. And he is working to position the state, the region at least, as an attractive place for remote and rural workers, while at the same time implementing computer science education in the local schools. And the state could really provide some critical resources to the development of this effort. You could provide the support to expand it to cover the entire state. You can incentivize community colleges to collaborate with rural and remote programs because they need that pipeline to employers, to their network of employers. So universities and community colleges are one way to do that. And of course, provide marketing assistance to them. Other rural states have already started exploring how to support similar programs, and of course, I would be happy to connect you with any of those folks. One thing, if we're going to support rural and remote, it's also important to understand that the success of that program or any program like that relies on our ability to address gaps in broadband affordability, coverage, and healthcare access, quality childcare. We covered the data from Pew Research Center and Gallup that underscores that that challenge isn't going to go away on its own. Those are non-negotiable factors. And I think there's two call-outs there. One that I really like to draw your attention to. One, healthcare access is a barrier to entrepreneurship. If we accept that entrepreneurship is important to the growth of rural economies, we need to understand why people may choose not to start a business, and healthcare access is one of them. For an unmarried potential entrepreneur over the age of 26, they might a lot of them rely on the security of employer-sponsored health insurance or a spouse with employer-sponsored health insurance. Keeps them locked in their current jobs. And I think in addition to the work that you do to explore other rural healthcare support programs like CSP and things like that, I would encourage you to maybe there are tax incentives that could be developed to support entrepreneurs to offset healthcare costs as they start their new business. And any other policy changes that might help in making that transition would be welcome. It's also important to note, and I think this is especially of interest for all of us here in Kansas, because this is an issue we have had progress on over the years, as Representative Kelly mentioned. Student loan debt is a barrier to entrepreneurship. And obviously with the Rural Opportunity Zones program, we've had some experience with this issue. So just to give you a sense of the scope, student debt seems to, it really does have an impact. So approximately 60% of individuals will be paying off student debt into their 40s. That's scary when you consider that the average age of an entrepreneur is 42. 43% of millennials say student debt affects their ability to invest in a new business or hire new employees. And 48% of young people who own or are interested in owning a business say student loans are one of the main barriers to becoming an entrepreneur. So there's some widespread concern there. One area that your committee could explore is, I understand one thing you'll be looking into is whether the Rural Opportunity Zones program could be extended. I would encourage some exploration of how you could go a little bit further than that even, and identify new policy features that could directly support entrepreneurs. And in just throwing out ideas, obviously this is just in the spirit of kickstarting some what I'm sure will be productive research that you're in exploration that your committee will do. But I would like to point out that current residents are not eligible for RAWs, but current residents could be valuable employees of a newly formed business. Is there a way to leverage RAWs as a benefit to someone that starts or joins a new business that is started in a rural community? Perhaps entrepreneurs that start a new business could also enjoy enhanced benefits of some sort through the program. I wouldn't want to get into what it look like exactly, but again, trying to help offset some of the risk, concern, and lower that barrier a little bit to an entrepreneur being able to actually start that business. Another recommendation I would make is to support, and this is something that's already started in a lot of our schools, support K-16 entrepreneurship education efforts. It makes sense, right? If we're going to try to realize generational change in rural Kansas, we really do need to think about how we support the next generation of rural Kansans. And like I said, there are already initiatives that have been going across our state. Some of you are probably familiar with the Youth Entrepreneurship Challenge, which is an entrepreneurship competition in grade schools, middle schools, and high schools. Those have been really popular, and they not only get kids excited about the idea of entrepreneurship, but it supports the growth of an entrepreneurship, thinking that makes them valuable employees. We all know that rural employers, one of their challenges is recruitment of talent. One thing we've seen grow in urban and suburban districts is the growth of real-world learning or project-based learning curriculum, which has a heavy emphasis on entrepreneurship. I would encourage exploration of how that might be adapted to a rural community. This is, if you're not familiar with it, this is where existing employers or startups might work directly with students to give them projects, basically like internships, give them practical real-world experience working in a business, working in a startup, helping them understand the work that they do, and at the same time building in official pathways to credentials and to college credit, and all the while developing skills that employers would find valuable. I would encourage you again to look at America's New Business Plan, where we talk a little bit about that. Kaufman has been doing some work in that area in Kansas City on our education side of the house, and be happy to connect you with folks in that space. And the final recommendation, and this goes back to what I think worked so well in ORD, it's leveraging the power of intergenerational wealth and experience, that transfer of wealth and experience. We all understand that one of the assets we have in rural communities is we have a wealth of knowledge, how to get things done, how to start and grow a business. And at the same time, in rural communities across Kansas, there are current business owners that are approaching retirement age that they don't really have an option of what to transfer that business to beyond closing the doors. That's a complete net loss for the community. You lose the services that they might provide, you lose the jobs that they provide, and it's a complete loss. And in 2020, I should point out, in 2020, we launched our first grant program as part of the Heartland strategy. We call it the Heartland Challenge. And we are currently funding programs in Missouri, Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas to support the transfer of businesses from nearing retirement business owners to generations of entrepreneurs. At the same time, we're implementing education efforts around the idea of using cooperative models in some of these businesses as an alternative business model that builds community resiliency and wealth. And a lot of these do rely on the direct mentorship and leadership of the retiring entrepreneur. That's exactly what they did in ORD. And they built this network of experience, and they use that to inform the next generation of entrepreneurs. And the community foundation directly supports it through estate planning and donor advised funds, particularly to the lending programs. And so, in closing, the Kaufman Foundation, we support the realization of a new heartland, and we want to support the entrepreneurship goals of all who currently live in rural, suburban, and urban communities across our region. And I, in particular, very passionate about what we can do in rural Kansas and the broader region. And we're doing that through grant making. We're doing that through convening leaders for peer learning communities, and we're just getting started. And I'm hoping that we have opportunities to work with the expertise of your committee and others who are similarly interested in the future of rural Kansas to really build that future. And I appreciate everything you're doing, and I hope to answer any questions about the work we're doing or rural Kansas in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Any questions for Chris? Representative Samsel, you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the testimony and the subject matter this morning. I've got a soft spot in my heart here as well, from Wellsville, Kansas, Franklin County, Overbrook, all those good areas. My question for Chris is, I've looked at the proponent testimony, or it may not be proponent, but the materials you've submitted. I don't see your contact information. If it's something that we could somehow get that exchanged at some point, and it doesn't have to be publicly for the whole world to see if you don't want it to, but that's number one. But then my substantive issue, if he could talk a little about, like I get it. I moved from Johnson County and Prairie Village. I was born and raised in small town America as well. My path looks a little bit different than yours, but when I crossed back down from Johnson County to Franklin County, my property tax bill on my car, among other things, doubled immediately. And my car didn't get any nicer. And my point being is we have a property tax problem crushing us in rural America. And in some ways, maybe that's okay. We don't have the business and some of the other things that Johnson County does. But that said, we also have a lot of outstanding things in our rural neck of the woods that people from Johnson County and Wyandotte County and Sedgwick County, they love coming to our rural areas, hunting, lakes, all of those things about rural life. That your point was very well taken on, let's work together and make this work for everybody. But when I knock on doors, the folks are not up in arms about income taxes right now in my part of the state. They're not even really that concerned about sales tax, to be honest with you. It's property taxes. And I think there's ways that we can work on those things together to mutually benefit everybody. But I guess my most pressing, and not to take this down a political route, and you may not even be up to speed on it, but there is a tax bill moving very quickly here in the State House in Topeka. And I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that. If there are ways, is it good? Is it bad? Are there ways to improve it to make it better work for the whole state of Kansas? My concern, just being straightforward with this committee and everybody else, is that when I've looked at the thing and when I asked him about it a couple of years ago, it's not really going to help the vast majority of people in my rural district or the small businesses or the farmers or a lot of the small town Main Street types, if you will. So I don't know. I'll open the floor to you if you have any thoughts on that stuff, but that's how I perceived it.
Yeah, would you like me to address that first, Representative, or do you want to open it to the floor?
Or what? Sorry, it broke up there.
Did you want me to address it first before other representatives commented?
Oh, I defer to the chair on that.
Okay.
You can go ahead, Chris.
Yeah. So one fortunate part of my job is I am bound from taking a political position, so I can't comment on any currently pending legislation or that it is making its way through the State House. I can say that obviously we all know that taxes in various forms have an impact on entrepreneurship, and I am reminded of a story of I was talking with an entrepreneur. I was in actually a building that she had repurposed into a kind of like a community space and in the laundromat, if you will, in Cottonwood Falls. And she one thing that struck with me, I love the idea, full disclosure, of what she had done. It was really cool. But one thing that struck me was that the property taxes far more than the revenue that the laundromat generated. And that was not particularly conducive to growing a business. Obviously, this is not a scalable business, but it's still, the point stands that that was a barrier in some ways. And if she wasn't passionate about it, maybe she wouldn't do it. But I can't comment on any pending legislation.
Thank you, Chris. And if there's some way we could exchange information at some point, whether through the chairman or vice chair or however, but that would be appreciated, and maybe take a little bit of this conversation offline. So thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
And I will say, yeah, I'll say it publicly, my email address is charris@kaufman.org, and I would absolutely love to connect with anyone that wants to set up time and love to dive into any issues deeper. Love that. And I'll make sure my full contact information is provided. So, sorry.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. Representative Day.
Okay, let's see if this works. Can you all hear me in there?
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay. So this might not be so much for this committee specifically, but I'm just wondering, I'm from California originally, Southern California, moved to Kansas for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons is I really like the open space. I like that there's fewer people, to be quite frank. But I'm wondering if there's an issue with, and if it helps at all for our regional airports to remain in a focus for, because for me, moving further outside of town, I would like to be within, reasonable driving distance to an airport that's going to get me to bigger cities in an easy manner. And as inexpensively as possible, even though that's not so much the case with regionals. But I'm just wondering if that's something that you found in any of your research is part of a concern that folks have in rural parts of Kansas and Nebraska, et cetera, or if that's just not even on the radar for people.
It is absolutely on the radar of people. First of all, I love that you moved from California to Kansas. Love California, love Kansas more. And yes, it shows up in a couple of ways. If you look at especially the Pew research, you can almost pick up on an assumption that people make that they can still connect with the world physically and virtually. That is a prerequisite. It is just baseline. There's a lot of discussion in just talking with people that might consider a rural community about connectivity. They want the space, but they don't want isolation. Those are different. And especially bringing it back to entrepreneurship, it's, you need access. You need hard infrastructure, whether it's rail or air or good roads for shipping. You need access. And so, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Hsu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Chris, for this. I grew up in a pretty rural town, Rolla, Missouri. Just part of my story, I went out to Los Angeles for school and then came back to the Kansas City area. So it's an interesting tension, I think, for a lot of us that have left rural areas, the tension between kind of the nostalgia and idealism of rural America, but with the entrepreneurship that you're promoting. To that point, so entrepreneurship is certainly important, but I think right now, I think we also need to take advantage of a reallocation of jobs from urban areas. I used to work for an ad agency. There's no particular reason that a copywriter for an ad agency has to live in the urban areas, right? And so, especially with the pandemic, I think there's an opportunity to take advantage of the portability of urban jobs. I grew up in Rolla, Missouri, and I moved away to kind of get access to more, cool restaurants, right? Like Rolla had 2 Mexican restaurants, 1 sushi restaurant, 1 Chinese restaurant. Guess how many Mexican restaurants I go on a regular basis in Kansas City, right? I go to 2 Mexican restaurants, I go to 1 sushi restaurant, I go to 1 Chinese restaurant. So just wondering if you had any policy ideas or just ideas about how to properly take advantage of, this newfound portability of jobs of the pandemic.
I would reference my recommendation around remote work. So, there's a lot to unpack there, and we're seeing some coalitions around the country come together with rural states with rural divides like Kansas, focused on how we make it viable for folks to choose rural life. Again, going back to the earlier question, people want the space, they want that idealism, that image of rural life, but they don't want the isolation that might also come with it. And what we're talking about here is choice, making it viable. And there are so many underpinning factors from childcare. Childcare is especially important. It's not going to work without broadband and childcare. And if you're going to make it viable for someone to move to a rural community, do any job, and there's network building, intentional network building here that needs to be done with our universities, local and regional, and our community colleges that have access to employers that might be able to recruit current rural residents. And there's also the reverse. Our rural communities don't necessarily have the resources to market their community as a potential destination for any rural job that can be done remotely. And they need a sense in that. One thing we're excited about on that, so Representative, as you said, the portability of work is really exciting in a lot of ways. We're also excited about the potential down the line impact. You get someone working in a rural community 2, 3, 4 years, and that side hustle they might have becomes something real. They realize that there's a critical mass of remote workers in the community, and they want a place to congregate. Maybe it's a coffee shop, maybe it's something else. There's venture formation that comes out of that second and third level impact. So yes, I think really connecting with the folks that are thinking about rural and remote, and not doing it in just an isolated Kansas way, but thinking about it as a coalition of rural communities from across the country could be really powerful.
Representative Hoheisel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Chris, for being here today in this presentation. Very insightful, especially for us individuals that represent city. I represent Southwest Wichita. We do have one question from a couple of committee members wanting you to restate that email address.
Of course. It is in, I wonder if there's a way to chat here real quick. I can drop it in the chat. It is C Harris, CHARRIS at Kaufman.org. And I'll put it in the chat as well.
Appreciate that. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions? Well, Chris, I've got a couple questions for you. You, in your presentation, you mentioned RAWs a couple times, and I think we're going to hopefully deal with that. At a minimum, extending the sunset, and at a maximum, looking for tweaks to the program. From, do you have any thoughts on, you gave one about using RAWs for an entrepreneur, kind of an assistance that if they want to start a business and they're already in the community, that you might be able to provide the student loan assistance to them. Any other thoughts along that line on RAWs?
Yeah, so you summarized the two, maybe enhancing the benefits for someone that starts a business, and maybe offering eligibility to someone that joins as that like key number 2 or number 3 employee that a new business needs. But I also think, I didn't get into this. I think there's needs to be some conversation around the funding mechanism for RAWs, because my understanding, and I could be wrong, please correct me if I am, that it is a split match between the county and the state, and it makes it a complex program. If the county can't come up with a match, it limits how much they can use the program, which is kind of a weird loop, right? Because sometimes the counties that need the most help can't access the program designed to help them. And so maybe looking a little bit as to how that fiscal burden is distributed could be helpful. And maybe, especially I know we did some work on trying to tie it to the employment needs of established businesses. Maybe enhancing that incentives for current employers to maybe use the program as a recruitment tool.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because that is an issue in my county. We're one of the largest users of RAWs as far as people applying, but the funds to match for the student loan reimbursement are very limited. So you have a lot of people on the waiting list. So the incentive's not really an incentive when that's the case. So that's one thing I think that really would help. Another thing that I wondered if you've come across, and you mentioned it a little bit, in smaller communities over the years, and in the years that I've worked for a bank, I've noticed as time has gone on, some long time residents that maybe worked for the large oil company that was in town, or others were very generous, had accumulated some money, and when they pass away, probably within a week, that money is out of the city and off to someplace else. And have you seen that in other areas, and have you seen things that may help with that, because a lot of things that you could do and you counted on those folks kind of have evaporated once that money moves to California, wherever. But I mean, it's not in your community anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you really appreciate you bringing that up, Representative Kelly. I look at that asset as being both experience and wealth. Going back to what I mentioned in Ord, that really was part of the real hook for them. They had a couple of really critical things that they did, and one of the most important things in their history is that they had the lawyer in town was really civically minded, really wanted to set up the future of Ord, and he did all the estate planning. He worked with the community foundation that they established, and essentially worked with with clients to, I think it averaged around 5% of the estate that they would put away in the community foundation to be specifically focused on leadership development and flexible capital options for entrepreneurs. And it also funded the entrepreneurship mentorship program. So they're really tackling it from every angle. You had the capital you needed to actually make the business viable, and then you had that knowledge transfer. And so because widespread, we know that the numbers are not great. The transfer of wealth out of a community, out of a rural community. I know locally in Kansas, the Kansas Association of Community Foundations been working with Kansas Health Foundation has tried to do some work on keeping some of that here. I think we really need to put some gas on that and really try to capture a slice of that pie. The mentorship piece can't be understated. And it really all comes down to the secret sauce in Ord was that they had an adaptive leadership framework to help people understand how to they're part of solving a complex challenge. And so I would say, there are things going on in Kansas that I think could be really, really helpful as we try to capture some of that. So like the Health Foundation is working with Network Kansas on a cohort of community foundations that are looking at innovative investment models, impact investment models that I think could lead to some really innovative stuff. It could really help if giving to those community foundations were directed at those growth models. I'd be happy to connect you with some of those folks as well.
Other questions for Chris? Yes.
Thank you, Chairman Carroll. It's less of a question than just to point out something that you mentioned, and that was negative self-talk and the limit of language. And I was reading an article that Chairman Kelly shared with us on rural Kansas is dying. I drove 1,800 miles to find out why. And I actually reached out to somebody who was in that article because he has an organic farm in St. Francis, and mentioned that K-State doesn't even have a course in organic farming. And so I just reached out to him for some information, and very interestingly, he sent back an article that was a response to that article from Jen Russell, who had a very long article talking about the negative self-talk and the limiting that the power of language has. And so, Chairman Kelly, I sent that to you this morning, and it might be a really good resource for the rest of the committee to read up on that and the positive work that they're doing.
Yeah.
And thanks for sharing that too.
Yeah, the article you mentioned, Representative, was that the New York Times article, I believe, like 2018?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, and I love the work that Jen does. I get accused of being naive and stubborn at times, but I really do believe that there's a case for optimism, and but that highlights one thing, which is aligning the institutions and the assets that we have, community foundations, community colleges, universities, with where innovators and entrepreneurs need to go to be successful in rural communities. And that's work that we can do. That's work. That's no reason to be pessimistic. That's optimism because it's something we can do.
Thank you. I'm all for optimism.
We all need it these days.
Representative Samsel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll make this very quick out of respect of everybody's time, but especially with this very distinguished committee here, and we've got Chris here. But I wanted to, you may know this as well, but this is something I see every single day in all 5 school districts, and because it gets into business growth and entrepreneurship and everything else. But my district borders Johnson County, and Johnson County is incredible in all kinds of ways, along with Wyandotte County and other neighboring counties, and then into southeast Kansas as well. But and I guess I will compare it with this, and the reason I'm raising it here with this committee is not only so hopefully we can tackle it, because I just spent 3 hours on the phone call or on phone calls with people yesterday trying to help on this issue. And my question will be, given your research staff and the Kauffman Foundation and all the incredible things that you guys do, help us, whether it's historically or moving forward. But I think there used to be things in place that would help this problem, and I don't think they exist anymore. But if they do, I've planted the seeds with a couple other representatives who are more knowledgeable on me on, the taxes and incentives on how all that stuff works. But the real life thing of what we've got, and we look at Johnson County, we compete against them in schools and academic and Scholars Bowl and music and everything else. And actually not just schools, they're courthouses. We've got a brand new, awesome state-of-the-art courthouse that's going to be the best place to litigate civil cases, criminal cases, all those things anywhere in the country. That's coming right to Olathe, Kansas very soon. We have about the exact opposite of that kind of in our rural areas. And we're not looking for new and shiny, but we are looking for functional and let us compete with the same people on a global scale that the rest of Kansas and Johnson County is. And so just real life stuff in my 5 school districts that range from tiny little 1A, I'm talking 12 members in their senior class. And that gets into some other issues of, does that make sense to have schools that small, but also up to 3A and 4A schools where we can do some really good things. But our problem is it's so bad right now. We don't have functioning, granted COVID, we don't use water fountains right now, but literally it gets down to our water fountains aren't functioning. Our locker rooms are not something where kids can take showers. We have asbestos in our cafeteria rooms, and we're using an old locker room as a math classroom right now. And we are more than willing to pay our fair share to get those things improved. But given the limited means that we have, and when property taxes is really the only viable option for us right now, we're handicapped in a lot of ways. So I just wanted to plant that seed. If you can shed any light, and I don't want to take up the committee's time more than I already have, but high level, how did we deal with that historically? Maybe how has it changed? What can we do moving forward? But I think there's really a lot of opportunities for win-win situations, both in urban and rural, if we can just turn the corner a little bit on those things. So I appreciate your time, Chris, and thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Representative. I don't know if I have a solution for you. I do. One thing we love at the Foundation is the ability to learn from where people have been successful in other parts of the country, and then taking those lessons and applying them to challenges that we're in areas that we are working in. There is an organization based in Springfield, Vermont, called Center on Rural Innovation. They have a very fascinating model for how they build density around, with the goal of building a tech-based ecosystem in a rural community. And they don't talk about it as much publicly, but one thing they've done in Springfield, in their hometown, they're working nationally, but in their hometown, they've taken this massive school building and basically renovated it using a very kind of complex mix of funders and funding mechanisms, national and state, or federal and state, to renovate this massive school building for a co-working space and everything else. There's a lot of expertise in projects like that around the country, and I'd love to connect you with folks like that if it's helpful to understand how other folks have done it.
Thank you. That would be helpful. The last thing I would throw out, we're doing some outstanding things with our trades right now. Yeah, we've got some students who are going to be awesome doctors and lawyers and all that good stuff, bankers, Mr. Chairman, someday. But also we've got way more kids that are like getting ready to excel in our trades, our HVAC, our linemen, electrical, if you will. And so we're actually collaborating very well among our small school districts right now. And if we get to the point we're able to link up with next door in Johnson County, we've got some of the best experts, but you're right, they're getting older, they're starting to retire, so getting our young people into those. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
If I could add one comment, Mr. Chair, before we move on, I think I mentioned it in my written version, but I didn't say it verbally. One thing that is kind of bubbling up in the region is the prevalence of maker spaces. The trades, as you mentioned, Representative, are a really great entry to entrepreneurship. They create jobs. There's opportunity for growth, and the services are really vital and needed. And with this growing network of maker spaces and trade programs, there's an opportunity to build on that expertise in rural communities, and I think that's part of the puzzle as well, to both entrepreneurship growth and also just hard infrastructure improvement as well.
One final question, Chris. When you mentioned infrastructure, I know that a lot of communities deal with that, whether it's water or whatever, or communications. But when a community is already at a point that it is a problem, and you're looking long range, have you seen any innovative ways that communities have tackled it head on before they have, when they're already dealing with a tax problem or whatever?
Yeah. Well, one example springs to mind locally. I don't know if you're familiar with the work that the Hutchinson Community Foundation is doing. So I would encourage you to connect with Aubrey Patterson out there in Hutch. Their community foundation is working with their local internet service provider to basically do impact investing that gets that last mile of broadband out to folks. It became really critical once COVID hit and all the kids were doing, remote school. I couldn't ignore it, and I think, frankly, I think that's a model that might be applicable to other parts of the region. I think there's a role for philanthropic institutions to step in and help with that. Because it is, broadband is quickly becoming an equity issue. We're talking about some kids having access and some kids not. And we all know the reasons why some kids would lack access and others would not lack. And so there's a role for philanthropic institutions. There's a lot happening on the national stage, with like Neuralink and everything else that might help us. There's something that always grinds my gears when I look to like Silicon Valley to solve our problems, but maybe this one's a gimme. But I think if we keep the pressure on state and federal policymakers to address the broadband issue, there's a lot of funding from the federal government for this issue. We haven't always, locally, we don't have a lot of capacity for grant writing. So our role might be for philanthropic institutions to provide support around grant writing as well. It might just be that simple, in addition to addressing it through innovative solutions like what the Hutchinson Community Foundation is doing and what we can import. So.
Hey, thank you, Chris. Well, I appreciate, again, you sharing your thoughts and expertise with us today. And my connection to Chris, I said, goes back a number of years, and he was very knowledgeable and very helpful with the RAWS program, and you've switched, broadened it out, and really appreciate your time that you spent putting your presentation together. And I'm sure there'll be some other questions coming your way, and we'll share other contact information and any other items that you may pass to us, we'll share it to the committee. So thank you, Chris, for spending some of your Wednesday with us.
Thank you very much.
And thanks to the foundation for making it all possible.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the committee. And I will make myself available in any capacity that might be helpful. And I just look forward to seeing where your work goes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, committee, just to give you an idea about next week, even though the Super Bowl celebration will be going on well into Monday here in the Missouri, Kansas area, we still will have a meeting on Monday because we've got quite a bit of territory to cover. On Monday, we're going to have a hearing on the banking bill, and this will be the bill that came out of the Senate that had the amendments. We heard the bill, and we heard about what the amendments that were wanted. This will be the bill that passed the Senate 39-0 this week. So we're going to hear it, get an update on what the amendments were on it. And then we're also going to have a hearing on the first-time homebuyer bill that came our way. That's a bill that was around last year, and it got caught up in all the pandemic action last year. So we've got that again. Then on Wednesday, we're going to work those two bills, the banking bill and the first-time homebuyer bill, and try to get those to where they go to the floor, because there are a couple key bills that would like to move on. And so Wednesday will be a day that to vote on those two bills so that we can pass it. If you're remote, you have to be at least remote inside the Capitol building to vote remotely. And if you can be here in person, that will be great too, because we will have a chance to discuss those bills and try to move them on. I believe on the banking bill, every amendment that we heard was put on between the groups, and then one extra that turned out to be a friendly amendment. So we'll hear about those on Monday. And then if we have enough time, there may be another bill that will work in on Wednesday, maybe for a short hearing on it. It just depends on how fast those goes. So hope you have a great weekend. I hope you have a exciting Super Bowl watch, that it turns out like last year's. And then on next week, we'll try to cover some territory and get some of the bills we have out and to the floor. So appreciate your time and questions today, and have a good rest of the week.